Hey friends, welcome back to another video. My name is Emma Lefebvre, and today we are doing a watercolor surface comparison showdown. So today we're comparing 100% cotton watercolor paper versus a watercolor canvas versus watercolor ground on a piece of cardboard. Now, I'm pretty sure that the best performance will be on the watercolor paper, but I want to compare not only which performs the best, but how they perform and how they differ. So if you are interested in this topic of today's video, stick around and let's jump right in and start. Okay, so we're having a watercolor surface showdown. I have my 100% cotton Paul Rubens paper, my Daniel Smith Watercolor Ground on a piece of cardboard, and then our watercolor canvas by Fredericks. So I have painted separately on all three of these before, but I've never really painted side by side to really examine the difference. So because I am testing it out and I'm not just doing one single painting, I really want to test two different methods out. So I want to do my florals on half and then do more of like a landscape with some layering to really kind of play around with all the techniques that I can, do. And we're just going to have to see how it works out. So this is not going to be like a finished painting that I'm going to frame or anything. This is purely for testing. So let's open up this canvas and we're going to start. Okay, so starting with the canvas, it does say on the package to wet this surface first and then leave it to dry for 10 minutes before painting. I did that in my other canvas tutorial video and it didn't make a difference. So I'm not doing that this time. So I am doing a landscape on the bottom half, florals on the top, and we're going to compare. And I've sped it up because I was watching this back and it was just too long. So it was a little boring. So I'm starting off by trying wet on wet. I wanted to see how wet on wet worked with each surface. And so that's what I'm doing. I just took my flat wash brush and wet up the background, taking some blue and seeing how it reacts for this sky. And to be honest, it did not react the way it usually does on paper. And I kind of expected that. I'm trying some purple here because usually my dioxazine purple spreads a lot, but it wasn't. So the thing I noticed the most with the canvas is that it lifted up easily while you're dragging your brush. So it was a little bit difficult to work on in the sense that getting that color on there, like dragging the brush across, you're really kind of dragging the color across too. It's not really sticking to the surface the way it does with paper. So that was a little tricky to work with. And that's something I can see potentially being an issue with like glazing. You're not going to be able to glaze. You're going to be able to layer on top and have like a darker color on top of a lighter color and have it cover it. But if you're trying to achieve a new color by layering it on top and glazing, it's not going to work on this surface. So here I'm out of frame. Sorry. So I just decided to do the grass. The one thing I did like about this was that because it didn't bleed so much, not bleed, but like expand so much, the color kind of stayed put where you put it, which was kind of nice. So adding some of the darker green there was nice, and it stayed put. And everything looked really soft. The blends looked really soft, which was really nice. And it was just a different surface to work on for this, which was interesting. So then I wanted to try and lift some of the paint for some clouds, and it actually lifted so well. The paint lifts so easily on the canvas. But then over a little bit of time, the watercolor started to recede back to where it was, which happens on paper too. I don't know if you can tell, it kind of goes back to its area. Not completely, but I had to dab it a couple times to really get that white surface, but it lifts like crazy. So another thing I also saw was if you wipe your paper towel on it, you'll completely lift the color. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Also could be, you could run into a bit of trouble if you don't somehow seal it after, I guess, because if you get it wet with like a droplet of water or something like that, it's going to lift the color even after it's dry. So see how the clouds kind of receded back a bit? I had to dab it again, make sure it was really dry so it didn't do that. But I mean, it looks pretty. And if you look at the horizon line, the green did kind of bleed up into the sky a bit. So it does move, just not as fast as it does on paper. Okay, so now we are going to try some florals, my usual florals. I feel like I have like a go-to floral pattern that I do, usually like a pink rose and then a peach kind of like anemone type of flower. But painting on this with the flower, which I did on my last tutorial of the canvas, it actually ended up turning out really nice. But see how there I added a bit more darker pigment. Again, it doesn't like bloom and spread the way it does on paper, which I like. But the color bleeds into each other. You can see that little bit of light pink bleeding into the orange was really nice. So this is me just painting. I'm just gonna keep going. Another thing I noticed, like I said, those bleeds were really nice, which was great because the canvas actually stayed wet for a lot longer than a lot of papers. So it gives you more time to work on it and get those bleeds and blends if you really want it to. The one positive thing that I could see with the canvas is that you can easily fix mistakes on this. So if you do a flower or a petal that you don't like, you can lift it very easily and then paint over it. So that's a positive, that you can fix a lot of mistakes. But again, how permanent is it? I don't know how you would seal it, because I feel if you put any kind of wet substance over top, it's going to lift. So if you know how to seal watercolor on a canvas after, let us know in the comments. I'm not an expert in that. I'm not sure. But I just see that any kind of wetness or dampness on it will lift the color. But it stays wet for a long time, so that's a positive. And overall, I think the flowers looked really nice. Okay, and so then you can see here on the landscape, it started to bleed. That ground, that green, started to bleed into the sky. I guess it was a bit more wet. It just took a little while to do that. But it was pretty easy to fix. Like I said, it lifts pretty well. And then you can just like go over, usually on a paper, you're gonna have that line where that bloom ended, and you're not going to be able to go over it and kind of smooth it out. On the canvas you were able to. I did have to go up into the sky to try and make it as even as I could, but it was able to be fixed, which was super interesting and something you can't do on paper. So now just finishing up the florals. The other thing I noticed about using the canvas is that the colors weren't as vibrant as I found with paper. It didn't really soak in like it does with paper, but in concentrated areas it was fairly vibrant. So doing the sky, it was really hard to lay down that color because with every brush stroke it moved the pigment around. But with smaller areas like these leaves and the purple, what are they called, lilacs, the paint stayed in a concentrated area, so it remained quite vibrant. It's just a lot harder for skies and large washes to get nice and vibrant and pigmented. Okay, so now it's time to test out the Watercolour Ground. I'm doing it half on the bottom, the same thing. You can see I didn't use the ground to the edge of the cardboard. The cardboard is actually the back piece of an arches pad, so that's what I painted it on. I am using the Daniel Smith Titanium White Watercolour Ground. If you have not seen my video on what it actually is, make sure to check out that video. I will link it below. It's like so cool, and I'm always so surprised when I paint on it. It feels and kind of looks like a plaster, like wall plaster, and when painting on it, it mimics watercolor paper so well. It's just so interesting. So the thing I noticed first about painting on it was that the color stuck, especially compared to the canvas. I didn't feel like I was moving the color around and it was like lifting. It stuck and looked super vibrant and kind of acted like watercolor paper. And for the wet on wet, if you noticed, it bloomed a bit more than the canvas, which was also mimicking watercolor paper, which I was impressed with. So I found it really fun to work on this. The last video I did, I worked on a piece of wood, which was really nice, but I'm really enjoying this flatter surface of the cardboard, and it's really nice and super fun to work on. So I'm just moving around the color, doing the exact same thing that I tried to do on the canvas, and it's nice to work on. So now I'm going to look and see how it does with lifting, and it doesn't lift as well as the canvas did, but it's still pretty decent, and I was impressed. It does kind of recede back like it does on the canvas, but it's not too bad, and it's pretty cool. So then we started with the flowers on the watercolor ground, and I have done a couple flowers on ground in the past, and I was actually pretty impressed with how it reacted on it. The stuff still blows me away, but adding some of that darker pigment like I did there definitely spread out and reacted more closely to 100% cotton paper than it did to the canvas. So that's a plus for me, because that's a feature I really like in working with watercolor, especially on a specific surface. And it was just really nice. The pigment glided on so nicely. It just really stuck, and it was easy to work on. It didn't feel like you were lifting every time when you would place your brush stroke over the, not paper, but the surface. So it was really, really nice to work on for this too. And yeah, so I'll just let you watch this a little bit. I don't think there's anything more to say. But yeah, it was great. The bleeds were really nice, and they seemed to be seamless as they were going on to the watercolor ground, which I really liked. So when you get that like purple here, I think I touched the pink a little bit. It's just a really nice bleed. And the other thing I noticed, sorry, I did say I'll let you watch this now, and then I kept talking. The other thing I did notice while I was working on it is that I didn't have any water control issues, because usually with either like cheaper paper or, specific surfaces, it can be really tough and it starts to pool. It doesn't really pool on the watercolor ground at all. It really like soaks in and reacts really nicely. So there's less of a chance to get those kind of weird cauliflower blooms that aren't always desirable. So that's a definite plus with this watercolor ground, especially working with the florals. Like you can see those floral petals bleeding into the green. It's such a nice seamless bleed. Like you can't see like a specific line or anything. It's quite nice. So that's a huge plus with working on watercolor ground, because even some papers don't react that way. Okay, so now lastly, we are going to be looking at our watercolor paper. This is 100% cotton paper by Paul Rubens, and I actually really like it. And we're doing the exact same thing. So the first thing I notice, and you probably notice, is look at that kind of effect you get with wet on wet. I think this surface was the one that kind of had the color explode the most and move the furthest, which is what you want with wet on wet. That's the beauty of that technique. So that's the first thing I noticed. And then as well as how vibrant the color was when it was laid down on that paper. So with 100% cotton paper, which is different than cellulose paper or 25% cotton paper, it stays wet longer. One, which is a huge plus, and two, it really soaks in the water and pigment. The way I like to think of a cotton paper is if you were to paint on a cotton cloth, like material or something, the minute you put that water and pigment onto like a cotton t-shirt, it soaks right in, right? It soaks right into the material and holds that pigment and holds that water, as opposed to, say, painting on a plastic surface. It's going to sit on top and bead. So that's kind of the difference in my mind, how I think of it with a cotton paper versus like a cellulose paper. I feel like with my experience, cellulose paper has a more, not plasticky feel to it, but it kind of mimics that, where you get more pools and it sits on top rather than soaking in to a cotton fiber. So that's my experience with it. Basically, it's just not as porous, right? So there's no room for that water and pigment to soak in, which is the issue. So with 100% cotton paper, you're going to get these beautiful bleeds, and it's going to be vibrant. You're going to get nice vibrant colors because that cotton really soaks in the pigment and the water, and it stays wet longer. So that is the beauty of 100% cotton paper, and that is what I noticed painting kind of side by side with these other surfaces. The watercolor ground was great. The canvas, I kind of like, if you feel it, it doesn't have that cottony surface. So that's why the paint, I believe, stayed more on the surface, and every time you would move your brush across, yes, that's what I meant to say, it would kind of pick up the pigment with it. That's also why it's so easy to lift, because it's not really soaking into the surface. So that is why you're going to get a more vibrant surface or painting with 100% cotton paper. I hope that makes sense. Also, because it stays wet longer, you're going to get really nice even bleeds. That is not always the case. Why can't I speak? That is not always the case. Water control does play a factor in that, something you do need to practice, because you can have those kind of wonky little watermarks with 100% cotton paper if you have too much water in an area and it pools. So it is possible, but there's less of a chance of that happening rather than on like a cellulose paper. So that's kind of my thoughts as I was painting on paper, which I've done many times and I love. And I think that's about it. So the one other thing I did want to test out with all these surfaces was layering and how it worked. So I did a couple of trees on each. I was kind of surprised. I thought that maybe the trees would lift up part of the background, but I may not have been able to see it as much with this canvas because I was layering dark on light. But I did do a little test here to see how easily it lifted after being dried, and it did lift. So that could either be a positive or a negative depending on how you paint and how you use it, because if you want to lift a part that you really don't like and you want to fix a mistake, that's a great positive to have with it. However, if you want to layer and do glazing, it is not going to work on the canvas at all. So then here was the Watercolour Ground, did some layering on this. I had high hopes for this, and I did test out to see if it would lift if I re-wet an area, like right here. Oh, and then I blended it out too. I wanted to see how it would blend out. Worked really nicely. And here lifting, it did not lift at all, which was great. And then I went back to the canvas really quickly because I forgot and I wanted to try and blend out the bottom of those trees. And that actually worked really nice. As long as you don't go over it and over it and over it, it shouldn't lift too much on the canvas. So it was able to blend it out without lifting too much underneath. So just added some dimension to the tree. And I was actually pretty impressed with how it layered on the watercolor ground. So then I did the paper next, and I've done this on paper a million times, layered perfectly. Paper is great for glazing and just doing like even transparent layers, all that kind of stuff. Blending out the bottom of the trees was really nice. And then for lifting, it did lift a little bit on the paper. I was kind of surprised. I didn't think it would. And all of these paintings had been completely dry for a little while. So it did lift just a little bit, but the ground definitely did the best job at that. So now let's look at all the paintings and compare. Okay, so now that all of them are completely dry, let's get into it and compare them. So as for the category of vibrancy, hands down, the winner is the 100% cotton paper. You can definitely tell just by looking at it. Look at the color of the sky, the grass, everything is just super vibrant. The way you kind of left it. The one that faded the most was the Watercolour Ground, which I was kind of surprised with. I thought it was going to be the canvas just because I found it harder to spread out that color and really have it stick. The Watercolour Ground seemed to stick initially, but as it dried, it did get lighter. For the canvas, I was surprised that in some concentrated areas, the pigment really stuck. So right here in these trees, this tree, and some of the florals, you get a really nice vibrant pigment. But if you're doing a large wash of an area, I found it a lot harder to get a darker vibrant color because with every brush stroke, you were picking up colors. So for bigger areas, it was pretty tough. But hands down, the 100% cotton paper definitely won that round. As for color bleeds, they all did fairly well. I think in my mind, just looking at it, the Watercolour Ground won. There is not one weird bloom mark on here. Every single color bleed is a really beautiful and soft bleed. You go right from green to peach or purple to green, and there's no muddy color in between. It just goes from one color to the next, and it's beautiful. As well as the gradients, you don't get any weird marks. And I'm actually surprised with that just because usually the best for color bleeds is 100% cotton paper, but there are a couple here. So like this kind of weird bloom mark, and it's not a deal breaker. It's just, it's funny how this one doesn't have any and this one has a couple. So nothing too big, but you get that kind of weird veiny mark right there, a little bit right there. For the most part, the bleeds are really soft and beautiful, like most 100% cotton papers. Like the horizon line here is really nice, and then like the yellow to green to darker green, all beautiful, but you do have a couple of those, and those are caused when you have too much water. So you can see how it's pretty light there. There might have been too much water right there, and this was starting to dry, so it bled into there and created that funky mark. It's not a bad thing. It kind of gives it a bit of texture and style, but I was really surprised on how soft every single blend was here, because I know I used a bit too much water in some areas, but it still dried as a nice soft blend and color bleed, which I was so impressed with. The canvas, however, it wasn't the best. I did get a couple of those kind of weird marks. Definitely a bit too much water or pigment, and it flowed into another area, and it just doesn't look as nice. You get a little bit of muddiness right here from the pink and green. Same with the purple and the orange. And like if you look here, you have like purple, orange. It's like pretty distinct. Here there's a little bit of brownness to it. I don't know if you can see that, but it didn't bleed the way I like it. So for color bleeds, hands down, that award goes to the Watercolour Ground. So as for layering, this is not the easiest to layer with the canvas. It does pull up the color, which is it's great for lifting. You can lift paint and color really easily, so you can fix mistakes, which might be a winner for the canvas, but I don't know, I think it makes it a bit tougher to work on. So as for layering, I think these two do a better job. This really kind of blends nicely in, and this is more of a layer on top. So they're a little bit different. And then the other thing I want to compare is the ease of working on these surfaces. Definitely feel like it was the easiest to work on the paper. It's probably because I know the paper best. But I found the canvas, especially for the landscape, really difficult to work on. It was hard to layer those colors on and have it stick and do what I wanted it to do. With more practice, I could probably get the hang of it, but I wasn't the biggest fan of the canvas. The Watercolour Ground, I am very impressed with. I actually really, really like it. And the thing that's cool about this is that you can put this stuff on any surface. So you can watercolor anywhere, and that's a huge, huge bonus. I am super impressed with this stuff. I feel like this is the most I've actually really played with it. So I'm really impressed with the Watercolour Ground, and it was very easy to work with. The only thing with the Watercolour Ground is whatever surface you are gonna put it on, you have to let it dry for 24 hours. So just keep that in mind. And then lastly, like I said, I think the ease of working on paper is just the best. But that's probably coming from a place of knowing how to work on it and my experience. So overall, I think I have to say, obviously my favorite is paper, but a really surprising favorite is the Watercolour Ground. I don't think I'd ever buy a watercolor canvas again. If hanging up your artwork easily on a canvas is something you'd like to do, this may be for you and may be worth looking into figuring out how to easily paint on it a bit more. Lots of practice. But for me, I'm not a huge fan of hanging up canvases in my house, but I do love the fact that the Watercolour Ground, you could do it on paper, you could do it on wood, you could do it on any surface, and you get this beautiful watercolor look. So that's my comparison, and I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments below. Thank you guys for watching today's video. I really hope you liked it, and I hope you learned something. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and follow me on Instagram for even more. Have a great day, guys.